Yeah, I guess it's a fundamentally different business model. Like in the United States, ideally the government answers to the people. The people don't want American companies doing shady things in the Pacific or in other developing countries. And so the government puts regulations and restrictions on the private businesses because they're not the same thing. In China, it's totally different. The big businesses are essentially an arm of the government acting for a political purpose to gain control and influence at all costs. So yeah, it's you really see how it is the Communist Party weaponizing industry and commerce for political purposes.
Yeah, and that has an effect on, say, U.S. military operations. Because if you have a country where the Chinese influence has developed to the point, that they're more of them look towards China, they're less interested in seeing the Americans showing up. And it's just a natural sort of development. So it's not just a commercial business competition, but it does manifest itself in the military realm as well. And this in the form of reduced potential access to U.S. forces, and also the sense that, well, maybe the Chinese are as much an ally as the Americans are. So it plays out in ways that one doesn't often think.
Yeah, well, which that makes sense from what you were saying earlier, which right now there isn't much of a Chinese military presence, but very quickly it could become that. While the U.S. has been edged out, suddenly you have a big Chinese military presence all over the Pacific. And then what are you going to do?
Do you think that there is some kind of, we have some kind of idea that, well, the Chinese aren't really interested in establishing a military presence? That's just not what they do. That kind of conventional idea, where did that come from? And is that valid?
It's not valid. But it has been the conventional thinking in large parts of the defense commentariat, the foreign policy class, that China doesn't have any interest in sort of a military presence beyond their immediate territory. They just want to make money. They don't want to upset the status quo. You'd hear that all the time, and anyone who suggested otherwise, you'd at best be ridiculed. And it's just not true. But that has been the thinking very much for a long time, where people are sort of getting out of that now. But that was the way that was the popular thinking for a long time.
That seems incredible to me, because if you just listen to what the Chinese Communist Party actually says, they have the goal of becoming the hegemon of Asia. So how can you not? How are people making this assumption that, oh no, they don't want to actually do what they're saying they're going to do?
No, just they need to put the military, the Navy ships around all of Asia to protect the legitimate commercial interests of totally private Chinese companies.
Is that what people were saying?
I don't think that was it. But right. Grant, where did the idea come from?
Well, that's coming. I think eventually, once the Chinese do put the military out, they're going to say, people will say, well, that's what all big countries do when they have overseas interests. What do you expect? And then if someone points out, well, these are the Chinese communists, for crying out loud, who want to get us out of the region at best and destroy us at worst. And then it's, well, there's nothing we can do. It's that old Yes Minister episode replayed again. But I think part of the reason for this has been a certain condescension. That the Chinese could never be our equal. They could never be like the Americans. We have this military presence around the world, and we're the most powerful military bar none. We spend more than the next 5 or 6 countries combined put on defense. So therefore, the Chinese just could never do this, which, as I say, it's a condescension. And don't forget, these are the guys that built the left half of the transcontinental railway, which was the hard half through the mountains. With picks and dynamite. So, but that has been, I think, no one will admit it, but I think there is a sort of a racial aspect to this idea, well, Chinese could never be like us. Also, once you find in that commentariat class that once you've staked a position, people rarely want to change it, that they will defend it at all costs. So now to suggest that the Chinese are, in fact, looking for a military presence and inroads into the region, as they have been saying, if you actually just read what they have said or read what they've written and listen to what they've said, to say that would be embarrassing. And a lot of people don't want to do that. So, it's human nature on display, I suppose. But, keep in mind that the Chinese, if they wanted, they could put together two what are called Marine Expeditionary Units. And this is what the U.S. Marines and the Navy have been doing for decades. That's 3 amphibious ships, about 2,000 Marines with all their hardware and helicopters. And they sail around the region doing exercises, port calls, establishing a presence. And that has been the backbone, really, of the U.S. military presence in the region. They float around or sail around from place to place. And the Chinese, if they wanted, they have the hardware and the manpower and the expertise to send these out and show the flag and establish an alternative to the Americans. And these are particularly useful for things like HADR, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. So when a hurricane or typhoon or flood smack some country, you send out the MEU, send out the amphibious force to save people's lives. And think of you get a lot of goodwill out of that. There's a political benefit to it, and you've established yourself as an alternative to the Americans. And as I say, the Chinese could put 2 of these together if they wanted, at least 2. For some reason, they haven't wanted to. I'm not sure exactly why. They haven't told me. But they could do it. So that we pay a lot of attention to their commercial challenge, and from a military perspective, a lot of focus on Taiwan, whether or not they could sink the U.S. Navy. But we're not paying enough attention onto these peacetime activities that establish influence. And that's where the Chinese they're able to do it. And one of these days they're going to be doing it. You're going to see this throughout the Pacific. And it probably won't be in the too far distant future.
Well, so for somebody who would say, what really is the difference between U.S. Navy forces floating around in the Pacific versus Chinese forces doing humanitarian rescue stuff, all the same thing, what really is the difference?
Well, if you're on the receiving end, the immediate receiving end, probably not. But at the end of the day, the Chinese are not the Canadians. The Canadians don't take hostages. The Chinese do, like the old Barbary pirates. This is a nasty regime. There's no 2 ways around it. If they open up the concentration camps and stop harvesting organs, then maybe there's a case to be made. But the fundamental nature of who it is sailing around does matter, just as it has throughout history. It was the Spaniards sailing up to England. What's the problem with that? They're just nice Spaniards. Or the Turks showing up in Venice. Well, they're just, we like Turkish food. The nature of a regime does matter. And we tend to lose sight of that, particularly because some people think there's so much money to be made from China.
Well, I think a lot of the issues you're talking about really are elucidated in the Solomon Islands, which has been in the news a lot lately. Sort of the Western media has been latching onto this idea of these violent protests in the Solomon Islands. Are they getting the story right? Are they getting the story wrong?
I think they're getting it more wrong than right. They kind of get the basics right, but as usual, the details are different. One of the great ironies of all of this is that the troubles in the Solomons, you have a prime minister basically driven by resentment over Chinese influence. And that, is the driving force. It's, of course, overlaying a society that is ultimately based on family loyalties, village loyalties, tribal loyalties, etc. So that would be a challenge in its own right. But the spark for all of this is the Chinese influence, in the sense that it's Chinese companies and Chinese who are looting the country, that they've paid off enough of the leadership to have their way. And the Solomon people themselves are basically losing their own country, but also seeing no benefit from it at all. And in any kind of society, but particularly those, when you're not getting benefit from something, and it looks like you're being treated unfairly and foreigners are doing it, that's not a very good mix to have. But you have in this case, you have the protesters, or the people who are unhappy with it, as has been reported. It isn't, they had been angry for a while, not surprisingly. But they showed up on the opening day of Parliament and protested. The police and the government responded, instead of with talks and coming out to see what's going on, they sick the police on them with tear gas. That tends to provoke a reaction as well. But these were peaceful protests until the authorities responded the way they did. But the thing is that to keep it, and this is one of these great ironies of foreign affairs, is that the current prime minister of Solomon Islands is basically, he's pretty corrupt. And he's widely believed to be on China's payroll, as are his henchmen, and he's used Chinese money to go after his opposition. And he's, has a lot of the blame for what has happened. But so what happened is that when the rioting started, that he apparently was giving some thought to stepping down. Then he apparently thought to ask the Australians if they would come help. So the Australians agreed to send troops, police, and diplomats over to stabilize things so the political process could work itself out. So what you have is the Australians, who are in a nasty fight with the Chinese, as we all know, now going in to back up the Chinese-supported prime minister of the Solomon Islands so that he can catch his breath now. This is what he's going to do, catch his breath and then enlist hired thugs to go after the opposition. There's an irony there. One wonders why Robert Mugabe didn't give the Australians a call when he thought things were getting out of control. Maybe they would have obliged. But there's always an inconsistency in foreign affairs, but you really saw it on display with what the Australians did in the Solomon Islands. And they say, well, we just want to give the political process a chance. But that only works when both sides are playing this game, playing the process the same way. And if one side is going to use its coercive power, and that means, as I said, hiring thugs to go murder your opposition, beat them up, to arrest and detain indefinitely community leaders, religious people, intimidate the other side into submission, that isn't quite the political process that most people have in mind. And that's, so it doesn't exactly put the Australian government on the side of the angels. And there have always been in these countries, there have been people, though, who, one, don't like the Chinese influence, but are basically pro-West, pro-freedom, just irritated by all this corruption, by the savaging of their countries by foreigners. And these are a potential constituency for us to take, for us to use to support, to actually promote our interests instead of standing back thinking that there's a nice Marquis of Queensberry rules boxing match or debate taking place, and we'll just let that play out, and then public wishes will be sort of manifest and that. But it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen any more in the Solomons than it did in Venezuela or in Turkey or any number of places.